Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Micro-Frontends in the Trenches. Today, I'm very excited because we have something different from all the other episodes. So, today we are talking about Zephyr Cloud with the co founder, Zack, that is going to share with us why Zephyr Cloud exists, what it is, because it's a game changing in the deployment of micro-frontends and seems that it's going to playing a very good part in the micro-frontends revolution. So today we are going to deep dive. I'm going to ask uncomfortable question maybe to Zack just to understand what is the vision for Zephyr Cloud about micro-frontends and how can help us. And we will discover also that Zephyr Cloud is not only for web but also for mobile. But I don't want to share too much at the beginning. I want just to introduce Zack. So Zack, welcome to this episode.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, as usual, we start with an introduction. But first of all, I need to congratulate with you and the whole team of Zephyr Cloud for a seed of investment that you received very recently, right, Zach?
Yeah, we've been working on since we started last year getting investments, and we just closed our seed round last month in September and raised $3.5 million. So it was a fun journey.
It's amazing. I mean, congratulations from me, and I think also from the microdance community that is listening to us. It's not, let's say, so usual to find a successful project founded in such a short amount of time. So, as usual, we start asking who you are and what you do. And I would add also, if you can tell us a bit more why you created Zephyr Cloud and what was the idea behind.
Yeah. So I'm Zack Chapple. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Zephyr Cloud. So I have one other co-founder, Dmitry Shkovtsov, and then we have another founding member, Zack Jackson, who's the guy who actually created Micro Federation. And a little bit about how we started. My background is development and architecture, right? So a lot of the work that I've done is in large enterprises, mostly HR software. And then after going through a bunch of HR tech companies, so human resources technology companies, I ended up going to work for Valor Software on the consulting side as their chief revenue officer. And it was actually one of our customers that got us into the Modular Federation because SAP, and this is public knowledge, SAP needed us to add Modular Federation support to Angular. So Dima landed a bunch of PRs into Angular to add Modular Federation support. That connected us with Zack Jackson, and then the journey just goes from there.
That sounds pretty cool. So we started from a real use case from a large corporate that was looking for using micro-frontends. That is a great story so far. But tell us a bit more about Zephyr Cloud. So obviously, we know that is a solution that runs in the cloud and will enable people to, let's say, deploy their micro-frontends in production, but probably there is more behind that. So can you give us like an eagle eye view on how it works, what it does, what are the benefits?
Yeah. So there's a couple things. So one, so Zephyr, when we first, I'm partially Italian. I feel like I'm using my hands when I talk.
Don't worry.
The way Zephyr started actually. So there was actually a project called Medusa, which I think you've actually talked about before. Maybe not on this podcast, but there's a project called Medusa, and we worked together with Zack Jackson to bootstrap that into something real. And we worked on that for 16 months. And one day we woke up and our Cloudflare account looked like we were getting DDoSed because we went from no hits in Asia to 1.6 million hits a day in Asia. We're like, what is going on? We're being attacked. And then we got an email saying, hey, we turned this on in production for a small subset of our customers. You know, the traffic's going great. But, you know, can you look into why the responses stopped? It turned out we hit our Cloudflare limit. So we had to go actually pay for Cloudflare, which is kind of a fun thing to see. Um, so we turned it on, and then we realized, like, hey, if enterprises are turning this on, there's got to be something here. So we talked to them, got them going. Our average response times for them was like 20 to 40 milliseconds. We're like, this is really great. So we tried to take it to all the enterprises that we were consulting with at the same time. And they're like, this is great. You're doing observability. You're doing version switching of, you know, federated remotes. This is awesome. But what we really need is to be able to develop faster. What we really need is to be able to test faster. And what we really need is to be able to figure out how to actually deploy these things to the cloud. And after 3 or 4 of our consulting customers said the same thing, we're like, okay, we need to pivot. We need to change what we're doing. And then that's why in August we started Zephyr, because the vision was so dramatically different than just the observability of micro-frontends. We had to figure out how do you properly deploy this and develop in a federated application. And that's why the vision changed so dramatically. And we started Zephyr.
That sounds a very interesting story. And by the way, those are nice problems to have, as I used to say. There are worse things in life than those challenges, to be honest. So I presume that by now, considering it's been a while that you're working in this space and with Zephyr, you have a bunch of customers. Let's say, can you tell us more or less what is the adoption is like? More startups company or more enterprise company? There is a specific target that Zephyr is suitable for the market?
So it's interesting because we have some organizations that have like 5 or 10 developers. And then we have organizations that have hundreds and thousands of developers. And it's interesting because it's less about the size of the organization, more about the pain they're feeling. And for the startups, a lot of it is about risk mitigation. They need to be able to roll forward and roll backwards instantly. They need to be able to test things instantly because they're in high risk markets. For the enterprises, it's more of solving the pain of we have a distributed team. We have people working all the time. They're trying to deploy applications all the time. We need to be able to actually collaborate because collaboration drops in distributed systems. Usually it becomes really hard to land things together, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And so the enterprises gravitate towards us because we give them the ability to be able to collaborate and move fastly in a very safe way.
Gotcha. And okay, so let's try to do a role play game. I'm a developer and I want to approach Zephyr Cloud. So how does it look like? Do they do? So first of all, if you can tell us what are the features available for Zephyr Cloud, I would say is a good starting point. And then we try to say, I would try to play the devil's advocate here and say, listen, I'm a developer. This is my stack. How can you plug Zephyr Cloud into it?
Yeah. So it's interesting because when we started fundraising, we said, Zephyr Cloud, adopting Zephyr Cloud is as easy as one line of code. And all the investors were like, oh, that's really exciting. And like developers were like, oh, that's really exciting. And then I had one guy come up and he's like, that's BS. I'm just like, I'm like, well, I mean, yes and no, because when you adopt Zephyr, and it's actually funny because we hired an engineer in the UK, and part of her interview process was, hey, I need you to go scaffold a front end application, deploy it to Cloudflare Edge, and then, we're going to compare the experience you went through with Zephyr. And after a day, she said, you know what, this is really hard. All the tutorials are either broken, the GitHub actions aren't working properly. Like, this is really frustrating. I was like, fantastic. She looked at me like I had 3 heads, and I was like, okay, now we're going to go do it with Zephyr. And NX generate React application, npm install Zephyr Webpack plugin, added one line of code, and which is with Zephyr. So we actually have a function called with Zephyr, and then just ran a build. And the way Zephyr works is that after the build seals, it will then go and publish those assets to the edge. So when she ran the build build picked up and said, hey, you're not logged in. Opened the window, she logged in, and then closed it, and then kicked out 3 URLs that were her application deployed to Cloudflare Edge. And she had a lot of expletives to explain how that made her feel, that after a day worth of effort it was challenging, but with, one command in, a couple seconds, it was deployed to the edge, right? And the reality is that that's how easy Zephyr is to start with, right? You can deploy any web-based application, and now to an extent mobile applications, to the edge. And on average right now, it's about 400 milliseconds. And that's a fun experience, right?
Yeah.
We joke about like, oh, you don't have to, link your GitHub repo to your favorite cloud provider and wait for a GitHub action to pick it up, wait for it to also build your application. You do a build, and by the time you click to your browser, it's live on the edge. And that's a really fun thing to have as a developer. So like that was the kind of starting point of the functionality. But then, obviously we built this for module federation, right? So, and we're built off the kind of the backbone of what Medusa was. So now you can imagine that same speed of iteration for every single federated remote. And because it's the remotes are being pushed to the edge, we're able to stitch them together on the edge. We're able to do what we call selectively substitute. So Zach Jackson calls it superpositioned infrastructure, but that's way too nerdy and sciencey for most people. So we selectively substitute. I made the mistake of one time in a call. I called it's like Schrodinger's remote, and they're like, "What?" That's way too dark. But we selectively substitute. So you can open our Chrome extension on your production website and swap out what you're working on locally. And now you can see the remote that you're developing on in production served by the same CDN and begin to actually iterate and fix your customers' problems really quickly. So there's a lot of fun stuff to come as you start using Federation and start to stitch together these applications. Because one of the other problems is you have really complex applications and you don't want to run 50 remotes on your laptop to be able to test something. You don't want to run all their BFFs on your laptop to begin testing. Sometimes you just want to build a header. And to be able to build a header locally and see it in a real environment is really powerful.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of stuff that I want to touch from this answer. So let's try to go in order. So first and foremost, just to give a bit of background, if you never heard about Module Federation, is a methodology that is transporting JavaScript modules from remote into an application like it was always bundled together. That's one thing that we need to highlight. And Medusa was, let's say, software SaaS offering that enables people to deploy these remotes, let's say, across the different let's say environments that they have. And in fact, the environments, I think, is the key word here, because in fact, you explained something very interesting, and we both have a background in enterprise, so we know how difficult sometimes it is to overcome the fear and the challenges to have a fast flow when in reality you need to go through all the different stages of testing and all the other stuff. So how do you handle multi-environment strategy that is quite common from my experience in many organizations despite the size?
Yeah, and it's funny because the company I was just visiting in Miami, they have 7 environments from development to production. And I think that's the most I've ever seen, that you have to go through that many environments. But it was interesting because they're like, well, how many environments can we have with Zephyr? And I'm like, well, unlimited. And they're like, well, that sounds great. And I'm like, okay, let me figure out why you're asking this question. And the way we handle environments is a little bit interesting because they're just named environments. You can call them whatever you want. You connect them to domains any way you want. But what's interesting is that environments follow tags or versions of remotes. And so let's say production is going to follow the stable tag of all of your remotes. And the tags by mean very similar to like NPM or something like
Yes.
that, right? Or Java. So Zephyr has concepts of environments, tags, and versions. And you can decide when a tag gets updated. So a production tag or a stable tag, you may say when a build happens on the main branch and it's the CI user, then you update the stable tag, right? Or excuse me, in their case, they actually want it to be manual, but they'll update the next tag automatically. And then they attach those environments and those tags to the individual environments that they're progressing things through. What's really fun about that is you can actually have like team specific environments, right? Like I may want to have one thing attached to the head, right, for my team. And now I'm able to see that and I can have my remote at head and everything else on stable. And I can basically do integration testing real time with my federated remotes. And then where that becomes really powerful for QA is they can begin to mismatch things together based off of what they're trying to test in their matrix of testing. And those versions of federated remotes may be, two next tags and a stable tag, a previous version and a stable tag. Like they can do all of that in an environment that's just a couple drop downs to get to it, right? And then even further, they can use the Chrome extension to do that in real time, right? So you don't even have to go and create an environment. You just go hit a couple drop downs, and now you're previewing 3 people's PRs and 1 person's work in progress all together at the same time, which becomes a very fun way to be able to test things.
Okay, so if I want to summarize what I get so far is that thanks with Zephyr Cloud, we can build and deploy our remotes and micro-frontends in general. Let's be more generic in this case. And I'm capable to spin up several ephemeral environments based on the company structure and the company, let's say, engineering capabilities. And therefore, that makes a solution that is extremely flexible, because from what we heard so far, it means that if someone is using with the ephemeral environments has just staging and pre-prod and production as a stable environments, all the rest can be matched easily with a branch that you spin up, and I have like my environment related to that branch, or I can also map one-to-one, let's say, the environment strategy that I have inside my organization. So if I use just one dev environment for all my teams, I'm going to use that with Zephyr Cloud and so on. So that, I think, is extremely powerful, because it's basically what I call a transparent tool. That I'm a huge fan of that, because people always think that when they build a tool, you need to change the way how you're working. In reality, tools, I like transparent tools, and I'm a big fan of, because they will fit in wherever workflow I'm designing today, but also tomorrow. Because the reality, we both know that in 6 months time, a year time, a company would change, and therefore it's very important that let's say the tools are still enabling us to reach our goals, more than us adopting a tool and change in order to make the tool working for us.
Right. Well, do you see ngrok fitting in that space too? Because I think that's one of the things that people have started to use to try and solve some of this problem, and I think ngrok kind of fits in that. And then based off of that, I can actually share a quick story if you agree that that's kind of something. So if you've ever used ngrok, which I'm assuming you have, the fun thing is that you can share what you're working on with people, right? The bad part about that is if you close your laptop and go home, they can no longer see what you're working on.
Yes.
Right. And that's a workflow that most people are familiar with. And Dima and I were preparing a call with a telemetry company. And we were all, so the way Zephyr works with tags is you actually have a developer tag for every branch you're working on for every federated remote. So he was working on an application, and he gave us his developer tag, which follows head, and every time he builds, it would refresh our pages, that sort of stuff. And as we were getting for this call, he switched out of WebStorm to Zoom. And for most people, WebStorm automatically saves when you do that. Well, he was working on a button that said break the world. And I don't know if you've ever had a button like that in front of you, but you usually start pushing it, right? And so we all started pushing this button that suddenly showed up on our screen when he switched back to Zoom. And he started getting emails from the telemetry company saying, hey, your release health is degraded. And that's when we realized the power of Zephyr, because in any other environment, I'd either have to use ngrok, or I'd have to make a commit, open a PR. If I'm lucky, I have PR environments, which we know in enterprise, not everybody has PR environments.
Yeah.
And then merge that PR, wait for a build, wait for a deploy, and you're 15 minutes to several hours away from being able to share your code with other people. Totally. He didn't even hit save.
Yeah.
Right? His IDE did it for him. And 400 milliseconds later, all of our pages refreshed and we saw his code. Right? In a production environment, because the way Zephyr works is it pushes it all to the edge, and the snapshots live on the edge. So that's really powerful. So when you talk about transferring knowledge, transferring tools, transferring state, and kind of that's dangerous conversation to get into. That's really fun to see that you can work that quickly.
yeah, we need those two. So you touched transferring state. That is something that scares me because with great power comes great responsibilities that we need to
Yeah,
highlight
right.
very often, because I have seen many implementation of micro-frontends that were going towards a very granular direction that risked to derail completely the effort just because they went too far. And I think we need to
Yeah.
find the right trade-off based on maturity of the team, the organization, what you're trying to achieve, what you need to express, and stuff like that, before we arrive and reach that level of granularity. But I think I got the point on how powerful this solution could be. And out of curiosity, how does it play with? So I'm imagining I'm a, let's say, a front end developer, a full stack developer working in my team, cross functional team. So I'm working with my colleagues on the back end that are developing their microservice and wherever it is. How does it play in that thing? So we do we need to create like let's say two different deployment strategy for both? Can I plug into a unique deployment strategy because maybe someone is doing server side rendering and they just put everything together, something like that?
Yeah, so the deployment strategy, it's interesting because the approach we took is very similar to, um, in some ways, Kubernetes, but not. We don't want to force everyone to re-architect their entire application, right? And initially, Zephyr was only working well with client-side rendered applications that were publishing assets to the edge, right? Which is most things, but there is a lot of server-side rendering out there. So in that case, anything that's client-side rendered would immediately work with Zephyr, and that's a really easy thing to do. And because we're a side effect of their existing build, you don't have to change any of your pipeline to start using it, right? And you could use it as in addition to your existing deployment, right? And then once you establish trust with Zephyr, then you could start to actually leverage the assets that we're publishing and the URLs we're giving you for your federated remotes. But until that point, you can just use your existing deployment pipeline. And if you're using module federation configuration, you can have us or your existing deployment as a fallback, right? So that works out really well. The interesting thing, though, is once you start to go all in on Zephyr, you actually delete a bunch of configuration because we're able to then infer those things based off the environment. So that's when your pipeline starts to change. And that's what that VC said, that's BS. I'm like, yes, to finally take advantage of everything that Zephyr has to offer, you do need to make more changes than one line of code. But most of that is deleting configuration because we don't need to know all the URLs because we resolve that as part of the snapshot based off the environments you're in. We don't need to know what you're providing or consuming because we're aware of that at build time. So because when the snapshot's calculated, we're able to see that, right? So there's some really interesting things that can happen because of that. So the deployment doesn't actually change until you want it to change. I think that's kind of where I'll go with that.
That makes sense, and I think is very interesting the approach they have taken. So trying to figure out how to let's say sneak into the process despite what the process is. One question I have is, have you ever seen situation where you have, like, for instance, a shared dependency that has to be deployed independently or stuff like that, and how usually your customers are treating this kind of situation? Because at the end, dependencies, as we all know, are let's say the complicated part, because even in a team, we have always, let's say, the team that is creating the shared dependency, and we know that in distributed system we try to avoid or reduce as much as possible this, let's say, shared dependencies. So I was wondering, is there anything that Zephyr Cloud can help in that situation?
It's funny because like my gut's like just use NX,
Okay.
but that
But not
NX
everyone
doesn't
works
solve it.
with Moriba, right?
Yeah. Hey, well, and so what's interesting is like that was actually one of the conversations I had last week. Is like how do we handle when the design system, because you're talking about dependencies, like a design system is a really good example of that, right?
Yes.
And design system updates, and everyone needs to go and update because of that. There needs to be new versions published because blah blah blah. There's a couple interesting things about that with Zephyr. Um, if the design system is changing in a way that doesn't actually change the code of the federated remotes, you can update that independently with Zephyr and, with module federation. And
Yeah.
that's a known thing. If you're leveraging NX, then, versions of the federated remotes will be able to get published, and, that's a known thing. Where it becomes interesting with Zephyr is we follow a concept of Semver on the federated remotes. So, the problem that usually comes from being able to change versions in different parts of the application is some teams aren't ready for that. Some teams, that's going to break them, right? And that's a very, common thing. And being able to say, I am the profile page, I'm okay staying evergreen with the design system because I'm not high risk. I don't care about if the profile page displays a little wonky. It's the profile page. That's okay. But something like checkout, they may want to only allow patches in. They may want to pin to a specific version that they fully regression test. And the difference is that with Zephyr, you're actually able to do that, but then also override it at runtime if something catastrophic happens, right? You can go in and change it in our UI and say, hey, you know what? I know I told you I'm okay with minor versions, but the team screwed up. I need to go revert right now. And that's a sub-second change, right? So that gives you the flexibility to be able to make changes when you need to, but also lock things down in the way that enterprises need to, right? And really make things safe. So I think it's the combination of Semver and versioning on the individual remotes, and then being able to decide how to move those things throughout your application.
That's very nice. And do you provide a dashboard where people can see what is deployed where, in which region, stuff like that?
Not yet on which region. Because most times we're dealing with the edge. So Cloudflare, you're not really dealing with multiple regions, right? Unless I'm really wrong. Same thing's true for Fastly and those guys, right? And Akamai.
No,
We
I
just
was
see it
thinking
as
that
one
because
edge.
sometimes and I work on few of those projects. You have the need to deploy, I don't know, in Japan, but not
Yep.
in UK, and therefore
Oh,
I want to deploy this there and not there.
So that we handle with environments, right?
Gotcha.
Because you could create each one as an environment, and then you could use your CDN to make that transparent or you make that opaque to the user. But yeah, you could use environments, and that's actually, there's a medical company we're talking to right now that wants to do that with their mobile application, because their mobile application has different versions of federated remotes for each of the countries, because country regulations, right? You have to have different things and different release speeds. So they're looking at using environments to do that. And, I said mobile, but that's because they're using React Native with Repack. Repack is now using RSPack. RSPack's able to work with Zephyr and Module Federation.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a really interesting mix of technologies that, especially in the wake of code push going away, is a really interesting alternative to be able to do over-the-air updates and versioning on your own infrastructure without having to spend a bunch of money on a per download basis, right? So they're really excited about that because they're going to be able to use that to deploy to all their different countries and be able to, which you may find this interesting, remove modules after someone goes through something like an onboarding. So now they're lightening their mobile application because they're basically going to eject the entire remote from the bundle and just give it a skeleton, right? So there's some really fun stuff there.
I think we need to highlight one thing in mobile development that very often is overlooked. That basically, when you deploy a new version before it's adopted by, let's say, vast majority of your users, for famous application, usually takes between few days to 1 week or two. But with this solution, you basically have an update of all the mobile application the moment that they open the application. That is, for me, a very intriguing capability that we need to highlight when you deal with micro-frontends on mobile.
Well, and we're doing it in a way that, so the CallStack team, which they've been really fun to work with, the way they did it is that you bundle the federated remotes that are kind of blessed, right? You have the versions of the federated remotes that you went through the full regression test. That's what you're going to push to the App Store. and then you can decide when to pull the next version of the federated model. So it still works in an offline. Right? So it's not relying on like real time web capabilities to be able to do that. But it does go and check. And then that's where the fallbacks really come into play, right? Like if you're not on the network, you can fall back to the one that you downloaded in cache, or you can fall back to the one that was bundled with your binary that you shipped to the App Store. And it's really powerful because, like you said, you're bypassing the multi-week, App Store approvals and all that stuff. The only caveat, and everyone who does React Native will be screaming at me as you're like, you can't do it. Well, you can, as long as you're not making changes to the native binaries, right? If you're trying to update your version of React Native, that's not going to work with Zephyr, like full disclosure, right? But if you're changing like,
I think that is fair because at the end is the shell that is containing your application. So what you change, that probably rate of change wise, React Native will have like a cadence of I don't know, I didn't check, but probably is a yearly change or whatever it is, or with minors probably every X month. But the real rate of change that you have in an application is your code, your business logic. Therefore, it makes sense that you accelerate that path. And if every now and then you need to bundle everything together for downloading an entire application, it's not going to change every week.
Yeah, I like that. I like that talk track too. Like talking about rate of change, right? That's a very compelling argument to why you should be using something like this.
Completely. And I think is the key advantage, right? So when you have a solution like Zephyr Cloud, you can potentially, let's say, identify this rate of change and then decide when to co-locate code together, when to instead, let's say, have multiple more granular fashion. Usually there are, let's say, few architects that are calling integrators and disintegrators. So the rate of change and the co-location of code is based on those, let's say, dynamics. And it's very important that we don't treat everything equally because in reality they are not. So I think it's a very important point that we need to bring together. But I'm very intrigued. So now that you talk about mobile, how many, let's say, companies currently are looking to have a stack with React Native and Micro-Frontends? And I'm asking that because I believe it is extremely compelling for all the reasons that we discussed so far. But in my, let's say, engagement with customers, I didn't find too many that are looking into that. There are a lot of discussion on we are researching into that, but maybe you have, let's say, a different story.
I think part of it's because the difference will be because we have a bias working with call stack, right? Because the call stack customers are already using Repack.
Yeah.
So, and since they're already using Repack, they're exposed to the Webpack, RSPack ecosystem. So there's a little bit more of a decision bias towards that direction and those capabilities. So they have more awareness of it. Whereas people that are just doing like mobile native or just React Native development by themselves and using, Expo, like they're not going to be seeing that as much.
Yeah.
So I think, but we over $100 billion in revenue is currently talking to us about $100 billion of their revenue. About you, we're not that big yet. Not yet. Talking to us about using that for their mobile applications, and it's a combination of, like I mentioned before, like medical field, e-com, and B2C, like those kind of people that need to be able to make updates quickly to their consumers. But you said something interesting that I want to go back to, because you talked about rate of change and granular changes. Yeah. And that connects really well into like concepts that most enterprises use, that's feature flags, right? Because I think a lot of people try to make things more granular and they try to do it by wrapping every single push that they do with a feature flag. And I'd be kind of curious, like, is that something that you're seeing quite a bit too?
Feature flags are nowadays, I would say, the easiest way for developers to deal with these requests. What I have found, although, and that's my personal experience, that is always great having a solution that does feature flag that is not mutually exclusive compared to Zephyr Cloud or any other, let's say, deployment strategy you want to apply. But I think it's complementary. The challenge I've seen is when you have a solution like Zephyr or any other, where you are capable to deploy your artifact, and you reason in a fact that say, okay, I'm deploying a new artifact, and then I make a change, and that will be what I have out there. But I don't have to change my code, because in reality, you are intercepting the request at the network level and then decide, okay, I want to use this over that version or so far. When you introduce feature flags, the problem is not adding feature flags. The problem is having the time to remove them and coordinating across teams. That's for me the experience that I have seen over and over and over again, especially because certain features, if you are lucky and you design very well the boundaries, is, let's say, atomic inside your boundary. But the reality is very often you need to coordinate across multiple teams to say, I'm releasing this feature flag. Are you releasing the same? Because otherwise we cannot activate. Is it like similar to what you have seen in the trenches?
Yeah, it's funny because I've worked with organizations that have like thousands of feature flags, and like 80% of them are at 100% or 0% ramp, right? Like it's no longer a flag that's been in production for 5 years. Go clean the code, and and that's the problem is like you have to go clean the code. You have to remove the duplicated logic. You have to remove the flag, and that's work. And the thing we hear is, I'm too busy to do that. My backlog's too full. I can't work on that right now. Or someone forgets that a flag's in use, they delete it from production, and everything goes down. Because it was some flag that had been sitting there for 5 years that was on 100% ramp, and now it's gone.
Yeah.
So kind of there's a couple thoughts that we have on that, right? The first one is that's not really a feature flag. Right? It's a way to be able to test things in production safely is what it basically comes down to. And if you have the ability to create a new version and roll that version forward and backwards sub-second, that becomes your mechanism for doing that, right? Because what they're really solving for is deployments take hours or days, and we can't be down that long. That's the real problem. So they use feature flags to get around that. So if your versioning is really easy and it's really easy to create unlimited environments, which is kind of the other problem, then you can use your routing to be able to decide how much traffic goes to each version based off of environments with Zephyr. You can make your blue and green. Yeah. The other thing that's interesting that that's now on our roadmap officially is the versions that are attached, feature flags that are attached to versions.
Okay.
So that's a really interesting concept that we got from one of our customers. And they say, hey, this version, I want to have a feature flag, but in the next version, it's going to become the default.
Okay.
That's a very common pattern, right? So the feature flag exists on the remote, and you can flag it and be able to ramp it and do what you need to do on that remote and other remotes. But then once you get past a certain version, that flag's gone.
Yeah, that makes
because
sense.
it's the new default behavior. So like that's kind of been our thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it makes sense because, as I said before, are not mutually exclusive. They are complementary. So those two things work pretty well together. The problem is if in a monolithic, let's say, system, when you are heavy on feature flags, the challenge is that you need to be extremely disciplined in order to have that, let's say, well embedded inside your system. That is not always for granted, unfortunately. That's the real challenge. So considering we are heading towards the end of this episode, I have a couple of other questions before we go. So first of all, Zephyr Cloud. So which cloud? Do you have like any cloud? Do you have preferences? I'm on one side of the cloud providers, but I'm eager to hear more about how do you intend to, let's say, provide? Is it like a SaaS offering? Is it something that I can deploy in my cloud or my on-prem, whatever?
Yeah. So, background in enterprise development, and you know this, good luck getting any enterprise to change their cloud provider. And so when we started, we're like, we're not going to be trying to force them. Like, even if we have opinions on which cloud is our best, right? Are we orange cloud? Are we black triangle? What are we? We don't want to be in that game. So we said, we have to have a built-in cloud, because people that want to experiment don't want to have to go create a bunch of accounts, and people that want to play with things that are outside of their work environment, they don't want to have to go create a bunch of things. So we needed to have a built-in cloud. Right now, that built-in cloud is Cloudflare. Just easy to work with. It took us very little time to implement. For bring your own cloud, that was something that we wanted to have so the enterprises can bring their existing cloud accounts and just connect them to Zephyr. And we have Cloudflare, Netlify, Fastly, I think, is landing this week or next week. AWS is in progress, Azure's in progress, Akamai is in progress. Basically, like as enterprises are onboarding with us and asking for their cloud provider of choice. And then, as big enterprises come in and say, hey, I need this one now, that's why Fastly got fast tracked. Because they're like, we had a big customer that said we need Fastly and we need it by, the end of the month. And we're like, okay. So we reprioritized, and sorry AWS, but Fastly took over, and because we had somebody that needed it quickly. But our whole philosophy is to be able to do that, and a lot of it also is because we actually have a customer in Brazil that we said, hey, what cloud are you on? He's like, all of them. I'm like, no, seriously. He's like, no, seriously. And I was like, why are you on every cloud? And he said, because they made acquisitions.
Okay.
And that actually makes sense, right? Because, you make an acquisition, it takes a long time to move them from one cloud to another because there's contracts and money and all that stuff. With Zephyr, you can actually see across all of them, right? So you can have teams and federated remotes deploying to each of the clouds, and you can actually switch which cloud you're deploying to for your web and your mobile stack now with Zephyr, and soon your APIs, but we'll do that a whole different podcast. But you can redeploy them to the other clouds using Zephyr, which is really interesting because if you wanted to A/B test, like, hey, leave my existing CI/CD pipeline deploying to Azure, but I want to test deploying to AWS, you just set that up in Zephyr and you can have both. And that's a really interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the very last question before we wrap up, what's the future of Zephyr Cloud?
The future is really interesting because not to get on the AI bandwagon, but there is some stuff that we're doing on the AI side around self-healing infrastructure, being able to understand when to revert different versions of remotes. You may be an organization that cares a lot about conversions, and you also care about error rates, but not as much as you care about conversions, right? Because you're an e-com company. If there's errors on the page, I don't care as long as it's still selling. So you may not want to revert just based off of errors. You may be a company that's in the compliance industry and you don't care about conversions as much as you do errors, right? Because data integrity is the most important thing to you. You may want to revert. So there's a lot of stuff we're trying to do in that space around handling the self-healing and doing that on the edge. So there's some fun stuff there. And then there's stuff that we're doing around being able to do additional levels of tree shaking after we calculate our snapshot. So one of the issues with federated applications is there's only so much tree shaking you can do because you don't know where you're going to be consumed. The nice thing about Zephyr is we have the entire picture in our head. And we can do another level of tree shaking. We can do another level of tree shaking on the edge. And with the stuff that's coming, with being able to run RSPack in Rust on the edge, there's going to be some really fun stuff that we can do with that. And then also we could just do some other stuff in the CI pipeline, but that's a different discussion. That's going to be a big thing. And then the feature flagging and A/B testing stuff that you're going to be able to do. There's going to be a lot of functionality we're adding in that space. And I think the biggest one, and you'll probably like this, is we're advancing our dashboard to be able to understand what happened where and when and the impact of that change, right? Because you have 50 or 100 federated remotes that are N levels deep, understanding who caused the cascading changes in LCP, error rates, and being able to see how that's progressing over time is a fairly difficult problem. Oh, yeah. And something that's on our roadmap that we're actively working on right now.
Amazing. Sounds all extremely compelling, and I wish you all the best for that future. And obviously, as usual, we will meet in some conferences like we already done a few times.
Yeah,
because we are both used to go to many. Maybe in US this time, next time. Who knows?
Yeah.
would be great. Zach, thank you very much for your time. I think for me it was very educative, and I like also the way how you are approaching the deployment, because it's something that for me was extremely useful when we invested time in my previous companies, looking into the CI/CD, accelerating the feedback loop for developers, focusing on fast flow for the developers, but also for the company, because if the developer can deploy multiple times per day, it also means that the company can test multiple times and different assumptions and see how the things are progressing, and is not, let's say, stuck with, oh yes, we need to do one deployment every month. So that for me is a fantastic testament of the work that you are doing, that match very well my way of thinking and interpreting a distributed system in general. So thank you very much for that. I'm glad that we had this chat, and I really hope that we will meet soon. So thank you everyone to listen to us. I hope that you enjoy, you discover something new, and you can always check Zephyr Cloud on the link that I will add in the description of this video, and see you in the next episode of Micro-Frontends in the Trenches.